Thank you. My name's Lou Eisen, and I'm a boxing writer and historian, and this is Ring Talk. And today we're going to talk about a wonderful fight that happened between the greatest fighter ever to have lived that never won a title, Sam Langford from Weymouth Falls, Nova Scotia, a Canadian, and Stanley Ketchel, which took place April 27th, 1910, at the National Athletic Club in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. On the opening credits there, you saw photos of Ketchel and Langford. Langford was interesting. I was looking at stuff at Langford last night on Wikipedia. I have a great book on him by Clay Moyle, which is the book to get. And they had a picture of Jack Johnson. I actually had to write them and make a notation there on the page that this is not Sam Langford, this photo you have. This is Jack Johnson. Johnson was 6'1", Langford was 5'6". So there was a definite difference in height. Langford was from Nova Scotia. His father was a brutal man. He was born in 1886, March 4th, and used to get beaten up all the time by his father, him and his, I think, brother and other siblings. His father was a dock worker, and of course, back then, being black and on the waterfront, whether you're in Canada, or anywhere, it was a brutal life. And so Langford at 13, 14, had enough. He said, that's the last whooping I'm ever going to get from my father. And he left. And he went to start working on the docks, different docks there in Nova Scotia, and did what many Canadian fighters did. In the Maritimes, he made his way down along the Maritime coast to Boston, where, he began his fabled and famed career. This fight, it was an interesting fight. Stanley Ketchel at the time was the world middleweight champion. And I don't know how many people know this, but Ketchel was very good friends with Langford and with Jack Johnson. And they never called him Stanley. They called him Steve. That was his nickname. Ketchel had no racism in him at all. He was very good friends with a lot of black fighters. He was a lot like Terry McGovern in that sense. He liked people. There is film that still exists of Langford, by the way. There's film of Ketchel, too, fighting Jack Johnson and other people, and we'll get to that. But there's film of Langford, two of his fights, Fireman Jim Flynn and Bill Lang. But it should be noted, too, that when they fought, after this, Ketchel had 4 more fights, and then he was murdered. And the fight with Ketchel. Okay, let's get to the fight with Ketchel. Langford fights Ketchel. Langford has a tough time coming up through the boxing ranks. He'd beaten a lot of really good guys. He beat Joe Gans on points 1903. He lost to Jack Johnson in 1906. I think it was his 20th pro fight. And Johnson had like 80 pro fights. And there's been revisionist history about that, as often happens in boxing, especially in Canada. And people are saying, well, a lot of people in the audience or the writers felt that Langford won. Langford didn't win. He didn't come close to winning. Johnson dropped him. It'll say in BoxRec in the 6th round, but he dropped him 4 or 5 times. And Langford dropped Johnson once, but Johnson dropped him 4 or 5 times, and he clearly won the fight. He gave Langford a good beating, but he could also see into the future, Johnson, and he could see what Langford was trying to do, and he knew that eventually, in 2 or 3 years' time, Langford would be difficult to beat. Because to start boxing and in your 20th pro fight the best heavyweight on the planet, is not an easy thing to do, and he went the distance. Johnson, it was said, held him up at times because Langford was out on his feet several times. You have to understand, that Langford was 5'6". So Langford fought, he fought lightweights like Jack Blackburn. Now that's an interesting fight because Blackburn went on to train the immortal Joe Louis. And so Langford at the time, I think, was 135 or 138 pounds. He was only 5'6". And then he moved up and he fought welterweights. He beat Barbados Joe Walcott, gave him a terrible beating. And then, of course, there's not much money in that. And then he moves up and he fights welterweights, and then he fights, his main category was middleweight to heavyweight. The turning point in his life in terms of boxing happened when he beat Joe Gans in Boston at the Criterion Athletic Club. It was December 8th, 1903. This changed Langford around, because before that, Langford was just a guy that followed you around and looked to land punches wherever he could. He wasn't thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead, which is what he became a master at. Great coffee, Starbucks. So how does that change? How does Langford go from being a really good fighter to being an immortal? Well, what happened was, after he beats Gans, he's at a local bar, and he's sitting there with Gans and a bunch of people. They were all friends. And a guy named George Budge Byers. Now, George Budge Byers was from Prince Edward Island. Here's the most incredible thing about this story of black fighters from the Canadian Maritimes that went on to become the best fighters in the world. Today, the African Canadian population in Prince Edward Island is infinitesimal. It's almost non-existent. So you can imagine what it was like in the 1860s and 70s. In the 1850s, there was a man, the original George Godfrey was born. He moved to Boston. He became a great fighter. And John O'Sullivan wouldn't fight him. One of his proteges was the great middleweight, another black fighter from PEI, George Budge Byers. And Byers beat everyone, but couldn't get a fight with the real champion, Tommy Ryan. Now you're thinking, Lou, how does this play into Sam Langford? Well, Langford was at the fight between Byers was at the fight between Langford and Gans, and he was at the bar after. And Langford certainly knew who he was and said, I beat Gans tonight. Yeah, he said, I saw. You got lucky. I didn't get lucky. I beat him. He said, no, you got lucky. Now, Langford was smart enough not to tell him off. He said, why do you say I got lucky? He said, he said, Joe, what? He said, you're right, 7th or 8th fight in the past 12 days? Yeah. He said, you caught him at the end of like 8 fights. I mean, the guy's exhausted. You beat him, but if he hadn't fought in a couple of months, it's unlikely you'd win. You had him ready to go on certain occasions, but you didn't do anything with it. And he said, what should I have done? And Byers got up along with Joe Gans in the bar, and they showed Langford what to do. This is what you do. Instead of throwing wide that right hand, keep jabbing with your left hand, hide the right hand, turn your body a bit to the side so he doesn't see it coming, and then come over with it. If you're going to keep jabbing, jab, keep doing it, and then one time, instead of a double jab, throw one, then throw the right hand. So he was showing him all sorts of tricks of the trade, which he could use to beat other fighters. And he was saying to him, there's certain tell signs. You can tell when another guy's going to throw a particular punch. And Byers went on to train him. His manager was Joe Woodman, who was one of the few honest guys in the business, trained Langford or managed Langford. But Byers was the one who turned him into an all-time great fighter. And it was interesting because George Godfrey was the one who turned Byers into a great fighter. So you have these great Canadian black fighters passing along their knowledge to each other. And of course, the very first at the beginning of that scale is George Dixon, the first black man to ever win a world boxing title, won it, lost it, won it again, invented speed bag, invented shadow boxing. So there in that bar, and you can see Byers on certain films of Langford. I just happened to notice it a couple of years ago, watching Langford film and then saying, wait a minute, that's George Byers. I can't believe it. And I was thrilled to have seen him. Byers lived until, I think, 1938, working for the Boston Electric Company. But they became close friends. And once a lesson was learned, Langford really picked it up. There's lots of wonderful stories about Sam Langford. Langford underwent incredible racism and just let it roll off his shoulders. In fact, when he fought in Paris at different fights, Paris, England, there'd be a white guy walking to him, and he'd step off the sidewalk into the street, and a British friend said, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm letting the white gentleman pass." And he said, "This isn't the United States. You don't have to do that." And he'd never encountered that. Being in Canada and the United States, whenever a white guy approached you, you would always step off. If you're a black man, step off the sidewalk into the street. That was the racism of the times. There's another great story of when he fought at the National Athletic Club there, and they were talking about referees. And Langford said, "I bring my own referee." And the British official said, "No, Mr. Langford, you don't do that here. Here we have our own referee." That's more of a Southern accent, but we provide you with it. He goes, "No, I bring my own." "Well, that's not allowed." And then Langford held up his huge right hand and said, "This is my referee." There was one of my favorite Langford stories, and I made Lennox Lewis laugh very hard with this, and it's a true story. He was in a fight, and he was told that, like a lot of black fighters back then, you can't really start fighting until after the 7th or 8th round. You got to let the white guy get some rounds in. You got to let him win a couple rounds. You got to let him hit you. You got to let him bloody you. And he did. And then they said, "Okay, now you can fight after the 7th round." So it's a 20-round fight. As he comes up for the 8th round, he touches gloves. And the opponent says, "Sam, what are you doing? You only touch gloves in the last round." And he said, "You're right. But son, for you, this is the last round." And it was. He knocked him out. In fact, not only did he knock the guy out, this was in Britain at the National Sporting Club there. There was a writer there for one of the papers who called Langford a coward. He said he had a yellow streak. That was a common insult to black fighters back then, that they had yellow streaks. They couldn't take it in the belly or they couldn't take it in the head, which reminds me of the great Joe Louis line when someone said, "You don't like getting punched in the stomach." And Louis said, "Who does?" Do you know anyone that particularly asked for that? No one enjoys that. So Langford positioned this guy where he's against the ropes, but sitting in the first row was this writer who called him a coward. And of course, Langford knocked him out into the writer's lap and then put his head through the ropes and said, "Hey, boss, how's that for a yellow streak?" So Langford was an incredible fighter. There's also another time where Langford's walking around the ring before the fight, and he sees the corner using different stools, trying one stool, then another stool. He says, "What y'all doing?" He says, "We'll see what stool would work best in between rounds." And Langford says, "You ain't going to need no stools." In other words, it's only going to go one round. Same thing happened when he saw his opponent's cornerman cutting up oranges. It's for him to gain energy. He can suck on them between rounds. And Langford said, "Well, ain't going to need more than one, because it ain't going more than one." And he lived up to it both times. Langford, because of the racism of the time, fought the other great black fighters. Joe Jeanette, an all-time great. He fought him 14 times. The great Harry Wills, who was 6'4". Langford's 5'6". He fought him 17 times. He also fought Sam McVeigh 15 times. And they would give, there's a key that black fighters would give each other. It was just a regular key. But if you saw a black fighter that you thought was uglier than you'd give it to him. That was a joke amongst the black fighters. And when Langford first saw Sam McVeigh, he said, "This is your key. I think you're going to be hanging on to it for a long time." So it was just a joke between them. He also fought fireman Jim Flynn, who held a one-round knockout over Jack Dempsey. He fought him 6 times. In fact, Dempsey, when they said, "You weren't afraid of any man," he said, "I was terrified of Sam Langford." When Dempsey was very young, before he became the big Jack Dempsey, he was still a teenager, got to New York, and he was managed by a guy named John the Barber Riesling, who was a criminal. Ripped off all his fighters for all their money and then put them in against good guys where they wouldn't last a round or two. Dempsey, it only had a handful of pro fights, found out, "You're going to fight Sam Langford next." And he just said no. And he left town. And he said years later, and he became very close with Langford, he just said, "Langford would have not only knocked me out within a round or two, he could have very well have ended my life had he so chosen." So he said, "There's no way I was going to fight the great Sam Langford." So Langford has to fight all these guys. And the thing about Jack Johnson was When Johnson fought Tommy Burns in Australia and beat him for the world heavyweight title, he'd signed a contract before that with the National Sporting Club in London, England, saying that if he beat Burns, the first title defense would be against Sam Langford at the National Sporting Club. And as we know, Johnson easily beat Burns, goes and travels all over the world after, but he didn't honor the contract. People say, well, that's, that was typical back then of Johnson. Yes, Johnson very rarely honored contracts, but that was also typical of boxing, and it still is today. So it wasn't necessarily just Johnson, but Johnson did sign a legit contract saying he'd defend against Langford, and Langford hated him for that for years after. And whenever he saw him, he said, "I'll fight you for nothing," But ironically, it was Jack Johnson who also drew the cutter line. He only fought battling Jim Johnson near the end of his title reign, who was a middling fighter at best. He wouldn't fight any of the black fighters. Johnson had certainly fought them before he won the title, and he knew how good they were. And at this point, Langford was great, and Johnson just said, "No, I'm not going to take the chance." But Langford, there's a misconception about Langford. They say he's always known as the greatest fighter to never win a title. That's true. And then the other thing people will say, well, he never had a chance at a title. That's not true. He fought Barbados Joe Walcott for the world welterweight title, and this was on September 5th, 1904 at Lake Massabesic Coliseum in New Hampshire, in Manchester, New Hampshire. And both guys weighed in 142 pounds. And then his newspaper said, Langford clearly won. I mean, he beat and battered him all over the ring, but it was called a draw. Back in those times, it was an agreement. If I can't knock you out, then the fight's a draw. It wasn't a points fight. And Langford won. There's no doubt about that, but he wasn't given the title, nor was he given a rematch. So what's interesting here is Langford was dominant as a welterweight, a middleweight, and a heavyweight. I mean, given the chance, it's a big if, but if no racism exists, silly thing to say because it still exists, but if no racism exists back then, Langford stood a good chance of being welterweight, middleweight, and heavyweight champion of the world. He was dominant in 3 different weight divisions over the course of his entire career. Langford was supposed to fight Stanley Ketchel. And this fight, as I said, took place April 27th, 1910 at the Athletic Club in Philadelphia. It was a 6-round bout. Now, some records will have it as a no decision. But it was clearly a newspaper decision win for Langford as he beat Ketchel. But here's some interesting stuff I just want to tell you right now about Langford. Langford, this happens every week. I guess I'm losing my eyesight here. Okay, so here we go. So tell you how great Sam Langford was. He had 314 professional bouts. He won 210 professional bouts. 210. Fighters, all the fighters fighting today added up together wouldn't be that. 314 bouts, 210 wins, 126 knockouts. He lost 43. Many of those losses were when he was legally blind. There was a draw in 53 of them. 53 of them, it's not that the fights were equal, it's that they just weren't given, they weren't giving out a decision at that time. So it was ruled a draw. And then, of course, after that, he had 8 that were considered no contest for whatever reason, whether he was cut or the other guy was cut, or they didn't want to give a decision. The fight with Jack Johnson was a 20-round fight at the Lincoln Athletic Center in Chelsea, but it was for the colored world heavyweight title. And his record and the record of Stanley Ketchel. So Ketchel had 63 pro bouts, 149, 46 knockouts, and 5 losses and 3 draws. You have to remember that when Ketchel lost the world middleweight title to Billy Papke, they came out to shake hands, and Papke walloped him and knocked him down. and then continued to wallop him and finally stopped him in 12 rounds. Of course, in the rematch, he destroyed Papke because he was too smart for that to happen again. Um, the amount of times these guys, fought each other and fought other fighters because of the racism of the time, Sam Langford had to fight the best fighters out there who were black. Joe Jeanette 14 times, Sam McVeigh 15 times, Harry Wills he had to fight 17 times, and I know I mentioned this before, but also fought fireman Jim Flynn 6 times. I mean, if you look at it, these to fight the same guy that many times. I mean, we see many trilogies these days, Chocolatito Estrada coming up. But to fight a guy 15, 16, 17 times simply because the best white fighters won't fight you is almost heartbreaking. It's hard to get up for all of them, but he managed to. So this fight, their fight coming up in Philadelphia, basically what happened was Ketchel said, if you do well and you beat me or you put on a good show, but we're going to make an agreement. You're not going to hurt me. I'm not going to hurt you. But Ketchel always made those agreements. He made the same one with Jack Johnson, and he never lived up to them. And Langford trusted him because they were good friends. That if you beat me in July, okay, because remember this fight's going on in April. April, May, June, July. I will give you a legitimate shot at the world middleweight title. And Langford believes him. And Ketchel was telling the truth. He had no reason to lie to him. So the fight starts, and Joe Woodman, who loved Langford, who was his manager, said to him, listen, just, don't go out and kill him right away, okay? I mean, they were about, Ketchel was a bit taller. Their weight was about 165 each for the fight. But just, give him a good fight, look good, but don't destroy him, because if you knock him out 1 or 2 rounds, he's not going to give you that title shot, whether he promised it to you or not. So they go out for the fight, and Ketchel, and Langford are sparring, they're throwing shots. And then Ketchel rings Langford's bell a couple of times, and he really starts to go after him. But Langford covers up, he holds his own, he parries Ketchel's shots, and they go back. He goes back to his corner, and Joe Woodman says, Sam, I don't think he's living up to the deal. And Langford says, you think? I think he's trying to knock you out. And Langford says, I'm going to have to fight all out, because if I don't, he will knock me out. And so Langford has to go out there and fight his heart out. And he does. And it's a great fight. Langford definitely wins the fight. But back then, you don't have points decisions. It was just a 6-round fight. But there were 13 writers ringside, from New York and Philly. So 7 of the writers said Langford clearly won. 4 gave it to Ketchel. And 2 of them scored a draw. I don't know who they were. Maybe they were the entertainment editors. But they scored a draw. Anyways, after the fight, Ketchel hugged him and he said, we're on for July. And Sam, you're going to get a big purse. And Sam was happy. I'm going to get a lot of money, and it would be a legitimate title shot. And this will be great because it's April, May, June, July. So I'm going to get a chance to actually train for this, and you probably fight quite a few more fights. So after that, Ketchel has 4 more fights. Ketchel was very well liked within boxing. When Billy Papke went to shake hands, and Ketchel extended his hand, and then Papke hit him and dropped him in the first round, guys like Langford and Johnson were really upset because they love Ketchel, and they just thought, that's not how you do it. That's not how you beat the champion. So Ketchel has 4 more fights. He wins the fights, and he has a farm, and his farm, I'm just looking for the address of his farm. Yeah, it was in Springfield, Missouri. And he was born September 4th, 1886, Stanley Ketchel, as opposed to Langford, who was born just a bit older, March 4th, 1886, in Weymouth Falls, Nova Scotia. So he's on his farm, and it was called, they were apparently a husband and wife team working there. They weren't husband and wife, they were grifters. They acted like a husband and wife. They're basically professional con people who would go out to different farms and places and gain the confidence of the people working there. And then when the people working there had let their guard down, they would rob them blind. And one day Ketchel comes down, on his farm. He loved living on the farm. He comes down to the kitchen where his safe is, and he sees this woman opening the safe and then taking the money. He goes, "What are you doing? Can't take my money." Behind him, there was an open window, and her husband or her partner shot Ketchel in the back, and Ketchel goes down. And he lived for another 3 or 4 days, so he named them, and they went to prison. When his manager Wilson Meisner heard that he was told, while he was having dinner in New York, Stanley was shot in the back by a grifter, and he said, "Well, count to 10, and Ketchel will get up." So the man's name, he gave his name as Walter Kurtz, but his real name is Walter Dipley, and the woman's name was Goldie Smith, and it was Ketchel's boss of R.P. Dickerson, who ran the farm, who hired them, and apparently Dipley shot him because Ketchel had upbraided him. He had chastised him in front of everyone. I think it was just a plain robbery, and they got caught, and that was it. He shot him with a .22 caliber rifle, and apparently, there's two stories. He shot him in the back, but it's also the story. He said, "Get your hands up," and then Ketchel stood to turn, and when he turned around, and looked at him, he shot him, and the bullet went into his shoulder and his lung, and Ketchel fell to the floor. And then Dipley took his handgun that he had with him and smashed Ketchel in the face with it repeatedly. And then he went, his partner went and rifled Ketchel's pockets. It was terrible. And they ran from the ranch, and then he told the former ranch foreman, Ketchel, C.E. Bailey, what had happened. And she told police, and then the woman who was caught said that Ketchel raped her, and that was the reason why Dipley had shot him. But of course, later on, she recanted that and said, "He never raped me. We were a team. We robbed a lot of farmers all over Missouri." And she'd lied completely, and she admitted it. But she said, I thought he would hurt him. I didn't think he was going to kill him." Ketchel was the reigning world middleweight champion at this time. So an award was offered for $5,000, dead or alive, to capture them. And Dipley was captured at a neighboring farmhouse the next day. And it was just sad. So, they both were found guilty of murder and robbery January 1911. And Goldie Smith had her murder conviction overturned, and which was, I don't understand. And she served 17 months for the robbery. Walter Dipley ended up serving 23 years before he was paroled. He died in 1956, 22 years after his release from prison. He should have been in prison the rest of his life for what he did, because Ketchel treated them well. Yeah, Ketchel yelled at him, but that's part of life. Having people yell at you like that, that's part of life when you're working on a farm. If the guy can't take that, then, but that had nothing to do with that. They had planned all along to rob him and kill him. Okay, so we get to this fight. There they are fighting in Philadelphia. And as I said, the first round goes by, and it's Ketchel's round. Langford comes out, and he starts to fight back, and he starts to ring Ketchel's bell. And Ketchel is an interesting figure in boxing history, because he was completely outclassed by Jack Johnson, but Jack Johnson was 6'1". Jack Johnson came into the fight over 200 pounds. Ketchel was 160. So, he wore a thick overcoat, weights in his shoes, and his pocket when he stepped on the scale for that. Langford wasn't as tall as Ketchel, but he was physically wider. He was a bigger man. Mike Tyson isn't tall, but he's wide, like a Coke machine. So Langford was handling Ketchel no problem, 6-round fight. And, Langford comes back after dominating Ketchel in the second round and says to Joe Woodman, his manager, what am I going to do? If I knock him out or I really dominate him, he's not going to give me a title shot. And he said it was an agreement. It's a written agreement. He's got to honor it. So don't worry about it. You don't have to knock him out. Just beat him. And so Langford refrained from trying to knock him out, but he beat him. He beat him for the whole 6 rounds. Why was it 6 rounds? Because that's what happened back then. It gave the public a chance to see two elite fighters going at it for a 6 round distance. And third round, Ketchel's landing some good shots. Ketchel is beaten, but he's still doing well. It's not a landslide. Ketchel is still getting his shots in Langford. He's taking Langford's best shots. Remember, they're the same weight. It isn't like Ketchel's or Langford's coming at 180 or 190. They're at exactly the same weight. And Langford's just so gifted at slipping shots and hiding his punches and landing them. But Ketchel's phenomenally strong. And they're really going at each other. And it's a very close fight. Third round, Ketchel comes out and he starts to wallop Langford. Langford clinches him, and then Langford starts going back after him. And this went on for the third round, goes on for the fourth round, fifth round, and they're really going at it. And the fight seems to be up in the air. But as the fans who were there said, Langford is clearly the man dominating the fight. Who knows what would have happened had the fight gone to 15 or 20 rounds. I think Langford would have stopped him because Ketchel buzzed Langford, sure, but I don't think at any time he hit him hard enough to stagger him or put any real fear into Langford. The fight goes 6 rounds, and there in the ring it's declared a no decision, although in those days you go to the newspaper the next day and the newspapers gave the fight to Langford. But Ketchel hugged him and he said, "You got your title fight. It will be in July." So in the meantime, Langford's still fighting other people all the time, and he just he's dominating all these other guys, and Langford was you have to see these stories to understand Langford. Langford knocked a guy out in 1 round once, then apologized publicly to the audience and the fighter. But he said, "I have a train to catch in 15 minutes. I couldn't afford to let it go more than 1 round." I mean, obviously acknowledging at that point that, the fight wasn't on the level. In other words, I was supposed to carry him for 8 rounds, but because I knew I would miss my train, I didn't want to pay twice for the same ticket, so I knocked him out. Langford had a great career. A lot of his losses near the end of his career and from the teens on to 1926, he was blind, legally blind. And so at the International Boxing Hall of Fame, I was talking about Jack Dempsey and how he knocked out Fred Fulton, who had a really good record, other than the fact Dempsey knocked him out in 18 seconds or 19. And this person said to me, "Well, Fulton knocked out Langford." Right, but he knocked out Langford when Langford was blind. So you can't really say knocking out a man who's legally blind is a legitimate boxing victory. It isn't. Langford had his career and he did well. Eventually, after his career, I mean, he was the Mexican heavyweight champion and he fought all over the world. He ends up in New York and he's broke, he's penniless, he's blind, and he's living in the back of a restaurant, and just him and his dog. He's completely blind and he's got his house coat. But Sam didn't complain, always smiling, always laughing, wonderful person. And a writer for the New York Herald Tribune named Al Haney found him, and he wrote a column saying, "A dark man laughs." And when he said dark man, he didn't mean a black man. He meant a man who lives in darkness. And he said it's very, very upsetting to see someone who's considered the greatest prize fighter ever to have lived over the last 300 years living completely destitute and blind and living on handouts from the owner of a restaurant. He was penniless. So when this happened, this was 1944. What Al Laney did was, he helped raise $10,000 from fans to help Langford. Langford moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts to be with his family. He was also that year enshrined in the Ring Boxing Hall of Fame, Canada Sports Hall of Fame in 1955. They held a tribute to him at Yankee Stadium. Jack Dempsey was the man who walked him in, and Dempsey loved him. And they helped raise money. He had surgery eventually. This is such a heartwarming story. And and he eventually got his eyesight back. And there's a clip you can see online. This is one of the great things about YouTube and having all this stuff online. There's a 2-minute clip of him talking. And sorry, I don't want to get emotional, but it's very emotional to me because voice contracts time. So to hear Langford talk is a window not only into his soul, into what it was like back then. So to hear him talk and see him laugh, and saying, I got my eyesight back, maybe I'll be able to see one of those pretty girls walking by, and he laughed. What really turned it around for Langford was in the, I think, 30s or 40s in New York. He was blind, he was crossing the street, he got hit by a car, ripped his jacket. He had less than 5% vision, ripped his pants. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who was Italian and Jewish, who was fluent in Yiddish, by the way, was in front of the newspapers helping Langford, gave him money for a new suit, gave him a lot of money, helped him out. And this sort of helped get Langford back into the public eye again, that this shouldn't be happening to such a great warrior. The thing about Langford was he never blamed anyone. He never complained to anyone. He never got ripped off by Joe Woodman. He just thought the money would last forever. And when he had it, he spent it. Athletes back then were never counseled. Well, you got to save your money for this, or you got to save your money for that. That wasn't a concept that existed at that time. So he never would have, he wasn't a stupid man. It just never occurred to him. He always thought after his career, he'd be working as a judge or a referee or in some capacity, but he was blind. So there wasn't really anything he could do. So Langford, lived the rest of his life in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and always had fond memories of Ketchel. Now, you have to understand, back in Ketchel's time and Langford's time, except for Jack Dempsey, let's say, and Jack Johnson, for the heavyweight titles, where you could say this guy was the guy that beat the guy, it wasn't like that in other divisions, because in the middleweight, welterweight, lightweight divisions, there were always several claimants to the title. So rarely a guy would come along, maybe like a Joe Gans, where you could say undisputably the world lightweight champion. But this wasn't like that in the middleweight world. And, Ketchel beat Mike Twin Sullivan in the first round to win the world middleweight championship. But then again, there were other fighters who claimed the world middleweight title at that time. But Sullivan was generally acknowledged to be the world middleweight titleist, and Ketchel knocked him out. He also knocked out his twin brother, another former champion, in 20 rounds. And as I said, he beat Billy Papke by decision in 10. Then he knocked him out. Then he beat Hugo Kelly. Ketchel, every other claimant for the middleweight title was knocked out by Ketchel. After being knocked out by Papke in 12, he destroyed Papke in 11 rounds, and he could have taken him out in the first or second round. He didn't. He wanted to punish him. And he took a terrible beating from Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, the world light heavyweight champ, when he moved up. He was a really smooth fighter. And he scored 4 knockdowns in the 9th and 10th rounds, and O'Brien was lying unconscious, literally on the mat with his head in the rosin bag or rosin box. But under New York rules at that time, O'Brien had been saved by the bell, and because of that, the fight was declared a no decision. Of course, they fought several weeks later, and Ketchel was knocked out O'Brien in 3 rounds. You don't want to wait this time. The fight with Langford had plenty of energy, as I said. Langford won by decision. They said it was a rumor that they were going to have the fight in July. It wasn't a rumor. It was a legitimate thing that they were going to fight. Ketchel promised him in the ring. There was a contract. He said yes, but then unfortunately Ketchel was murdered. And after he was murdered, it upset a lot of fighters, but especially Langford, not only because he thought that, and this really was his one lone chance to get a world title shot after the welterweight title shot. He really liked Ketchel. He called him Steve, as I said, and he hung out with him socially a lot. Ketchel didn't care what other people thought. In fact, Ketchel and Jack Johnson would go and carouse whorehouses all through the Midwest. Ketchel didn't see color. He liked everyone, and he loved the sport he was in. So Ketchel was buried at the Holy Cross Cemetery at Grand Rapids, Michigan. And until the Ford family came along, it was the best attended funeral in the history of the state of Michigan. And there's a plaque in his honor that you can see. If you go there, the corner of Stocking Avenue and 3rd Street, and there's a statue at 438 Bridge Street northwest, and the Ketchel Valley neighborhood on Grand Rapids West Side is named in Ketchel's honor. So as I mentioned, Langford lived to 1956. He'd gone back he had a daughter when he was young. His family grew to be very large. He'd gone back to see his kids, and his kid and his grandkids. And, he would come by and visit in Weymouth Falls, and they would say, "Who's the blind man there?" Like, "That's your grandfather. That's your great-grandfather. Do you know he's the greatest boxer that ever lived?" And he lived a long, long time, Langford, 1886 to 1956. And January 12th is when he died in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's considered by far to be the greatest fighter to never have won a world title. And when you look at Ring Magazine, even writers today, it's an interesting thing. When you go to the Hall of Fame, they're writers my vintage. When I say that, I mean, I'm about to turn 62. So a lot of people I spoke to, like my mentor, one of my mentors, Bert Sugar, always thought highly of Langford. And so did so many other great writers. And they would say, he was the best to never win a world title. And my mentor, father figure, Angelo Dundee, never met Langford, but his brothers certainly knew him, Chris Dundee. And he said Langford was a great fighter, great person. And, it's doubtful guys today could have done well against him. Imagine a fighter today like a Canelo, but he had more power and more brio and more intelligence. And, today, to dominate the middleweights and the heavyweight division, as well as the welterweight division, would just simply be unheard of, because Langford wasn't physically a big man. But he was very well liked within the sport. He's in the International Boxing Hall of Fame. And as I said, of all the fighters that have fought in professional boxing over the last 300 years, no one has been at his level and not won a world title. And that was Langford. Langford's also the linchpin, starting with all the migration of all the great fighters from the Canada's Maritimes down to Boston. So it starts with the original George Godfrey, not the American Phoebe Williams. He changed his name. And then it goes to from George Godfrey to George Budge Byers, who was the colored middleweight champion. That's what they called it. Godfrey held the colored heavyweight title, and Byers also held that. And then you get Langford. He trained. So Godfrey trains Byers. Byers trains Langford. And Langford helps out other fighters. And that's the way it was done back then. So Langford is really the linchpin in all of that. He's the most famous of all of them, and still famous to this very day, still holds a hallowed place. You have to understand something. His last fight was 1926. He was legally blind. His heyday was in the early 1900s, 1900, 1910, and a bit beyond that. And we're in 2022, and yet any book that comes out on the greatest fighters of all time, like Bert Sugar's book, Langford's always in the top 3 or 4. Still in the top 3 or 4, because tremendous skill, tremendous ring smarts, phenomenal one-punch power. When he was allowed to actually go out and let his hands go, he could drop anyone, anywhere, anytime when he wanted to. You talk about Ali predicting the round. If there were no metaphorical handcuffs because of his skin color, he would have been able to predict every round on which he beat a guy. And these guys, you see them, when he knocks them down, they're done. They hit the canvas, they don't move. And these weren't bums. A lot of them were very good fighters. But Langford's skill level and intelligence in the ring and his balance was so superior to anyone else on the planet that time, except maybe for Jack Johnson, that Langford dominated boxing at that point. The shame, of course, is that he never got a chance to, a legitimate chance to win a middleweight title or to challenge again for the heavyweight title, because ironically, Jack Johnson drew the cutter line himself, even though he himself was African American, because he knew, and he faced Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh and Sam Langford. He knew how good they were, and he knew it was a big risk fighting them, especially Langford. And he didn't want to take that risk. And that's the champion's prerogative. But if you get a chance, pick up Clay Moyle's book on Sam Langford. It's a wonderful book. And also go to YouTube and watch both Ketchel and Langford. I don't think their fight is on YouTube, but you can watch them individually. Langford's phenomenal to watch. You don't really get a sense sometimes of Ketchel because the film isn't that great. Sometimes it's grainy. But Ketchel was a gifted fighter. Ketchel knew what he was doing in the ring. He wasn't just throwing punches willy-nilly and closing his eyes and throwing punches out the window, as the old trainer Charlie Goldman used to say. He knew how to set a guy up. Langford was brilliant as well at using a man's own momentum against him. You want to rush into Langford, face first, go ahead. But like a matador, he's going to move to the side and catch you with a shot in the chin, and you're just going to fall. So many guys you see when they fight Langford, bang, get hit, and then hit the canvas, and they don't move. And you wonder why the referee's counting, because Langford's in the corner laughing, joking with people. And the guy, even after the count's over, and the film still rolls on for another 1, 2, 3 minutes, the guy's still on the canvas. He hasn't moved. His cornermen are looking at the guy, Jim Flynn, whoever it is, and the guy's just not moving. I mean, when Langford knocked you out, you're out for a good 20 minutes, half an hour. I mean, he turned out the lights of a lot of guys. There's a lot of wonderful stories about Sam Langford and how kind he was, and how much people truly loved him. And that was evident when they had the benefits for him and had the one at Yankee Stadium with Jack Dempsey. And Langford didn't whine or complain about the loss of his eyesight. He didn't complain about his station in life, the fact that he ended up broke. He said, I had more fun than Rockefeller, and he did. He said, I traveled to Australia, England, France. I was all over the world doing what I loved. And you can't have a better life than I had. So he's one of the all-time great figures in boxing. And so is Stanley Ketchel. It's hard to get a good reading on Ketchel today in relation to today's middleweights, but different kind of fighting. Boxing evolves. And Ketchel was the dominant middleweight of his time. And he was so good, he beat heavyweights and light heavyweights and did so rather easily. So these are two all-time great fighters. The shame, of course, is the fact that they never had a chance to fight a second fight, because that would have been a 15 or 20 round fight, and there would have been no handcuffs, figuratively or metaphorically, on them. They could have actually gone out there and fought to their heart's content, and that would have been one of the all-time greatest fights. But if you get a chance, watch film on both these, man. Next week, we'll be back, and I'm still working on getting the author of the Hurricane Carter book. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. This has been Ring Talk. I'm Lou Eisen, and we'll see you again soon.